You know how they call Hayao Miyazaki the never-ending man in the animation industry? Well, the Marvel Cinematic Universe is kind of like that, the never-ending franchise in all of entertainment. For the last 17 years, under the management of producer Kevin Feige, the MCU has become an iconic achievement in the entertainment industry as a whole. But recently, for some people, it has also become overabundant in its existence. Unfortunately for this franchise, it does seem to teeter-totter between quality and quantity, which causes its committed audience to turn away from it altogether. And it started from someone on the internet claiming that the franchise should have stopped at Avengers Endgame. Which brings us to the ultimate question. Is the MCU dead? Personally, I think the only way to answer this question is to look at where the franchise started to where it is now. Starting off with the Infinity Saga Phase 1. Starting off with the first 5 movies before Marvel's The Avengers. Iron Man 1 basically being not only the start of the whole entire cinematic universe, but also a comeback story for actor Robert Downey Jr. After being sent to prison for drug use and coming back pretty much on top of his game, this pretty much sealed the deal for his and how it's skyrocketing even to this day, even despite a little bit of a hiccup. But that comeback story pretty much inspired what seemingly becomes a monument of a cinematic achievement that we wouldn't see coming. Though The Incredible Hulk wasn't exactly one that actually kept the ball rolling, nor did Iron Man 2, it at least gave us an avenue as to where this franchise was actually going. After the first Iron Man movie, it actually connected with The Incredible Hulk when Robert Downey Jr. came to meet Mr. Secretary, played by William Hurt, after the Bruce Banner incident. Hulk and Iron Man 2 are the best movies of all time, but But thankfully it does get better with the movie Thor. Thor is basically a lesson in humility, learning that you don't always have the power in the world, and when it can be taken away from you, and you have nothing, sometimes you're left with a seed of your own wit, and then you realize, there's not really much you can do. Once he gets that power back, he realizes it teaches them humility. And more humility can be learned from Captain America, the first Avengers. He understands what it's like to have no power from anywhere, a scrawny loser who can't even enlist in the army just based on how he looks. And so when he's given a chance to take a super serum, that gives him the chance to finally become something that he never thought he could be. And then he gets frozen to an iceberg and ends up in modern day. And that leads us to the end of Phase 1, which leads to Marvel's The First Avengers. This pretty much sealed the deal for what the cinematic universe was trying to stand for. Basically, the live-action crossover comic book movie that we all wanted to see for years. And we finally got it, and man, is it a long time coming. And now we move on to Phase 2. We continue with Phase 2, which starts with Iron Man 3 of Tony Stark basically losing everything in an explosion from the Mandarin, I believe, and ultimately left to fight in the sea of his own wit. But that was his own damn fault because he gave away his address. So what do you think was going to happen? Anyway, he recovered from it, and yeah, that was about it. Not very much to say there. Neither much to say with Thor: The Dark World. Thor: The Dark World is probably the least memorable out of the entire MCU. Like, Incredible Hulk and Iron Man 2 are bad, but at least you remember them in terms of how the impact of those movies in general. But with Thor: The Dark World, it's probably the least memorable one. It doesn't really have that big of an impact, but it at least allows us to know what one of the Infinity Stones is. And now we move on to probably my personal favorite MCU movie, Captain America: The Winter Soldier. This is where shit got really bad. I mean, in the context of the story, the movie is fantastic, but it showed how little trust you can have with the people you're close to despite working so closely to them, and then realizing that the ones that you sworn to protect are the ones that want to kill you. Even when it came to Steve Rogers' best friend, James Buchanan Barnes, also known as Bucky, also known as the Winter Soldier, who was presumed dead in the first Captain America film, but actually ended up sharing the same fate as Steve Rogers, being buried in a block of ice and then revitalized later in the modern day. And in a way, and while they still defeated the bad guys, it still left their situation unresolved, and they're left to be in hiding. Out of that entire context, and relating to none of what happened in those previous 3 films, we lead to another great film, Guardians of the Galaxy. A group of delinquents who are basically a bunch of greedy assholes trying to steal shit, and who find themselves in a galactic war against an evil dictator who wants to destroy planets around him using the Power Stone, which is one of the 6 Infinity Stones. And despite them being delinquents, they go in pretty much kamikazing their way into the situation, not guaranteeing their own survival, which I think is pretty admirable. And it makes them great characters. And again, out of context, we go to the second Avengers movie, Age of... This is the lesser great Avengers films, which isn't entirely a bad thing per se. It's still decent enough to watch. Would I say it's the most memorable? Maybe not so much, but it's better than Dark World, so we'll counter blessings there. And it does its job just fine. It's the same Avengers movies that you would expect to be. It's not as much of a cluttered mess than that's Ant-Man. Ant-Man had a really bad director-writing sort of feud between director Edgar Wright, Patton Reed, and a few other writers of the film. Basically, Edgar Wright had a specific vision on how he wanted to execute the character, in which he wanted to turn into a heist movie, but that went against the whole MCU agenda and kind of left Edgar Wright as one of the 4 writers' credits. So even though it was kind of a mess, and the movie does kind of show a little bit, and still not as memorable as the rest of the MCU films, it still at least manages to be somewhat watchable. And now we get to Phase 3, which is known to be one of the most commercially successful phases in the entire MCU saga, starting with the most ambitious one, Captain America Civil War. Now this is done by the Russo brothers. I forgot to mention them earlier. They also make Captain America Winter Soldier, and they end up going on to making the next Avengers film, but we'll get more into that later. For now, we'll talk about Civil War. Now, it's bad enough that Captain America, and nor can the rest of the Avengers, can trust what S.H.I.E.L.D. ever did for them, but now they can't even trust each other, into which they have to end up fighting each other in order to, in the argument that they either need to be put on a leash because of how much destruction they put on the rest of the world, or to simply run freely, knowing that they can still protect it. And that's kind of what causes the feud between each other. And it's a very interesting and very well thought out feud between both Captain America and Iron Man. Out of context of that, Doctor Strange makes an appearance, and we understand his life story in terms of going from a surgeon to a magical mastermind. That I don't know how those two things go together, but the visuals look cool, so I mean, there's that. And Benedict Cumberbatch is just awesome. And even with Tilda Swinton, with all the whitewashing and all that, it is a little strange. It's even stranger that a British woman runs a Tibet monastery, or is it Malaysia? Some monastery that's run by a British woman. I don't know how that works, but whatever. And now we move on to Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2. Again, out of context. Not as good as the first one, but still just as fun to watch. Guardians of the Galaxy still manages to be the charming film that we all know and love, with a great soundtrack and great characters to go along with it. And as well as a great story and great visuals. Yeah, this movie's great. I love all 3 of these films. I'm just saying that right now. And after his appearance in Captain America Civil War, and numerous feuds between both Disney and Sony, we finally get our first Spider-Man standalone film, Spider-Man Homecoming. We now have Spider-Man as a young teenager, played by a 20-something-year-old Tom Holland, who basically, he's just trying to find his way in life and trying to figure things out, as while also trying to be Spider-Man. You know how Spider-Man works. It's nothing really all that spectacular, but it's still a great film to watch. I personally like the next 2 that come after this film. This one isn't entirely my favorite, but I still enjoy it because, I'm a big Spider-Man fan, and he's the first comic book character I actually grew to love, and he's always been my favorite. So while it's not my favorite Spider-Man film, I mean, we all know everyone's favorite Spider-Man film, but my point is, it's there to at least exist, and it actually is of substance, so it's not entirely, it's not entirely pointless or anything. It's not even close. And now we have Thor Ragnarok. Thor loses his hammer by his sister named Helena, who happened to have worked with Odin in a past time, but it was hidden away from Asgard and never to be seen in the light. And now they're just trying to save Asgard, but turns out they didn't need to. Asgard is its people and not the sanctuary. So it made sense as to why they had to leave it behind at the end of the film. And now we come to the source of vibranium, the source of Captain America's shield, Black Panther. I already talked about how awesome this film was when I was talking in my previous video about Ryan Coogler's awesome directing skills, and how this movie became a financial success following up with the previous films that came before in the MCU. And it was a pretty big deal knowing that it was nearly all black casts leading as the leading people in the entire film, and to have it be a commercial success was a really big deal, just as much as it was when it first came out as a comic during the Black Panther movement in the 1970s. So the fact that both versions of this character has become a big deal in different parts of time goes to show how great of an impact this character has. And it's actually pretty cool to see. And now we finally get to the big one, Avengers Infinity War. The Avengers' very first losing streak they've ever had was cost them the lives of half of their entire human population, as well as the rest of the entire universe, by the mercilessly philosophical Thanos, who is by far one of the best villains to ever exist in literally anything of cinema. Right up there with that guy from No Country for Old Men. Those two should probably have a party together. They would most likely end the world by doing so, but yeah, they belong to each other. Anyway, this movie's pretty great. The other two films, not so much. Ant-Man and the Wasp was serviceable at the very least, but still successful because the MCU was still being pretty successful. Again, this is a very commercially successful phase throughout the entire franchise, and so was Captain Marvel. Both films aren't exactly all that memorable and not really all that serviceable, but they do serve as a decent Deus Ex Machina for Avengers Endgame, which was the final nail in the coffin for pretty much the success streak that this franchise had, even gotten as far as to become the second highest grossing film of all time, right under Avatar. And by God, is it a monument of success that it definitely deserves to be. But it doesn't end Phase 3. What ends Phase 3 is Spider-Man Far From Home, which I think is much better than the first Spider-Man movie, because not only do we get to see Peter Parker actually being, as he's trying to be more than just him trying to be Spider-Man, but also just trying to be a hero just with moral values, because they're always being questioned, and now it also cost him his entire identity to be exposed. And that ends Phase 3. So I'm kind of getting ahead of myself in terms of the overall success of the MCU after Endgame, to which I ask the question again, has the success streak actually ended after Endgame? No. Well, I can't say most of everything that's happened throughout this entire franchise has been uberly successful as it previously was. That's not to say that the MCU in of itself is completely dead, because there's plenty of films and even TV shows that the MCU has come out with that are actually very good, just as much as the old ones were. And there are also some that aren't as good. So let's just list them off for a second. So I mentioned Spider-Man Far From Home, that being the last before the entirety of 2020 because the pandemic, kind of leaving us with little to no Marvel anything throughout that entire year. We did end up having WandaVision that came out in January of 2021, and that ended up being pretty good. Then we had Falcon and Winter Soldier, which was also very fun to watch. Then we also had Loki, which was pretty awesome. But then we got to Black Widow, which was a lot of people said it was terrible. I don't think it was terrible. I just thought it was kind of underwhelming, which I guess pissed off a lot of people, saying that it is underwhelming considering the track record of the MCU. So it is kind of surprising how it came out that way. So I can see why people don't like it. But then we had Shang-Chi, which was fucking awesome. Shang-Chi was just a great film to watch. From its action scenes to its fighting choreography, its pacing, it's very well done. It's a breath of fresh air when it comes to its fight scenes. It's right up there with Winter Soldier. It's that awesome. Eternals, however, not great, but not terrible. But again, that leads us to the inconsistencies. It was just an average film. But Spider-Man No Way Home, that was the best Spider-Man movie to ever exist, right next to Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse and Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse. But in terms of live-action Spider-Man films, No Way Home is definitely the best. But then we also had Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness, which was so-so. And then we also had Thor Love and Thunder, which was also so-so. Black Panther Wakanda Forever, a lot of people didn't like because we didn't have the character T'Challa in the film as a lead role, but instead we had his sister, played by Letitia Wright, who also got a lot of hate for it for some reason. And I don't understand why it's being directed towards her specifically, because she didn't really do anything wrong. She simply just got in front of a camera and just read her lines and acted. I don't see why she's getting hate for it. She just simply accepted her role. I think people just didn't like the film because T'Challa wasn't there. Am I saying it was disrespectful? No, it's if anything, it respects the actor in terms after his passing, trying to move on to a brighter future. Sorry, it's not what you actually wanted, but I don't know. I thought it was fine, but a lot of people didn't like it. And that ends Phase 4. Phase 5, things got even more, a little bit more inconsistent, but at the end actually got a little bit better. But we had to get through the bad in terms of inconsistencies, which started with Ant-Man Quantumania. This was one of the worst Ant-Man films to ever exist, and the worst MCU film to ever exist, that actually ended to the MCU's first flop to ever exist. The movie was so bad, it actually got the head producer fired from her job because of how bad it came out to be. But things got a little better when we had Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3, an emotional story with our same lovable and charming main characters, and it's an emotional journey that we'll always love to see with these characters. A movie that we'll watch and rewatch on its own just for its own existence because we like these characters so much. The Marvels, I'll be honest, I haven't seen it, but because I don't really care for it. Maybe it's because I'm not a big fan of Brie Larson's attitude in terms of how she treats this role and how she treats the people around her. It's very Rachel Zelger-ish type of behavior. It's very nasty and very toxic. But that's why I never watched the film. And then it was that point where Marvel basically took a break from the MCU and didn't really have a film until about Deadpool and Wolverine in 2024. But that was the only film that came out that year. Usually they have at least 2 or 3 films coming out within the same year because they like to work year-round. That's how Disney usually likes to do with their films, which is fine. Deadpool and Wolverine was the only film they had out, and it was very good. In terms of Deadpool movies, well, I can't say which one's better or worse because they're all pretty damn good on their own merit. They're all pretty consistent, so. And then Captain America Brave New World, it was okay. Its pacing was kind of strange and indecisive in terms of how I wanted to execute it, because it didn't really have much material to work with, which meant a lot of moments in the film went too slow for us, to the point where it became too boring for us to listen to. And then there came other times where it was too fast that information just kind of blew over your head, and you're just left wondering what the hell was that about? What did that have to do with anything? And it's just a weird situation there. We still got some good performances. We still had Anthony Mackie reprising his role as the new Captain America, which he does a very good job as. I mean, he did a good job as Falcon in Falcon and Winter Soldier, or just as his character in general. He was always charming, charismatic, and even wise for his position. He always knows the right thing to say when it comes to doing the right thing, but sometimes he doesn't always know the answer in terms of how to solve his own problems. And I like that struggle that he goes through in terms of how he tries to execute an actual problem. That in itself I actually do like. I just wish the movie fared out a bit better, which is what I can say for Thunderbolts. That was a huge surprise. A movie that I thought was actually going to be a complete waste of time actually managed to give me a lot more than I thought it would. And it was a breath of fresh air in terms of the inconsistencies of the MCU. At the very most, I can respect what they were trying to do, and now they're trying to use those characters as the new Avengers per se. Bit of a big jump, but I guess it can work. We'll see what happens. And that's pretty much it in terms of how the MCU is going so far. So in terms of it being dead, it's not even close. And not just because they have the money to do it, but the audience is coming back slowly but surely. Even with Captain America Brave New World, which was kind of average at best, it still brought the audience back, and it seems like it still might have a chance to actually keep going in terms of the whole franchise. In a way, I don't entirely think it's completely dead. It might be inconsistent at times in its recent years, but it's not to say that it won't make a comeback. It definitely will. We've seen Disney in its biggest slumps before, like many times before, but they still managed to make a comeback. So I'm not worried at all. These movies, while they're not all the way perfect, there's no way they haven't left a huge impact on the industry as a whole. I think it might be something we'll be holding on to for a long time.